Welcome, welcome, welcome. We'll be starting this special webinar in a moment. Please be mindful that we are recording this. Fantastic. It's great to see a lot of familiar names, and we look forward to seeing some more joining us. Excellent. We'll start in a moment. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really nice of you, and I'm sure we'll have a wonderful, wonderful time. Alrighty. 10 more seconds or so. Alrighty, folks, welcome. As I said, we are recording this special webinar, so please keep that in mind. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. I'd like to express my deepest gratitude, as always, to Avis Koyman and Srusi Suresh for all their assistance behind the scenes that make this and all other events possible. I would like to thank the audience for joining us today for a special webinar titled Disengagement from Gaza 20 Years Later, featuring Dr. Arnon Degani, whom I'll introduce in a moment. I would like to mention, however, before we start, that our next webinar is titled Israeli Culture and Art in the Shadow of Conflict, featuring Dr. Vered Weiss from Michigan State University. It will take place online on Tuesday, November 18th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information and to register, please visit www.israelstudies.und.edu. Now, 2 decades have passed since Israel's unilateral disengagement or withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, a decision that reshaped the social, political, and strategic landscape of Israel, and to a large extent, the region as well. In August 2005, the images of Israeli soldiers evacuating settlers from the Gush Katif area and the dismantling of Israeli military installations marked what many perhaps hoped would be the beginning of a new chapter, one that could open a path towards peace and coexistence, perhaps. But 20 years later, as we mark this anniversary, we do so in the shadow of a devastating war. Since the horrific attack of October 7, 2023, the ensuing war in Gaza, and the rather fragile ceasefire, if it's still a ceasefire based on today's events, the questions raised in 2005 about security, sovereignty, and the prospects for any kind of peaceful future for both people appear to have returned with renewed urgency and painful clarity. This moment invites us not only to look back, but also to look deeply, to examine the assumptions that guided the disengagement, to consider what has unfolded since, and to think critically about what Israel, the Palestinians, and the broader regions have learned or failed to learn in their intervening years. Today's conversation brings together a scholar and an observer who has thought and studied deeply about these issues. I think that together between the speaker, Dr. Degani, and the audience, we'll see how the legacies of the disengagement continue to shape the present and how understanding that history might help us think about the uncertain years ahead. Without further ado, it is a pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Arnon Degani. He's a historian specializing in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He earned his PhD in history from UCLA. His doctoral research, currently under contract for publication as tentative title, Are Arabs, unless it already has changed, examines the everyday lives of Arab citizens of Israel under the military government between 1948 and 1966. He's currently a fellow at the Avraham Harman Research Center for Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a research fellow at Molad, the Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy. Dr. Degani is also the writer and co-host of the Oslo podcast, with its latest season focusing on the relationship between Israel and the Gaza Strip. This is highly, highly recommended podcast. Dr. Degani, perhaps will correct me when he starts, but I don't think there's an English translation or closed captioning. But if you can, if you are able to understand Hebrew, it's fantastic, phenomenal. Both seasons are highly recommended. They provide first-rate analysis that is grounded in meticulous historical research, in my view. And as always, in these events, Dr. Degani will speak for about 30, 35 minutes, and then we'll open, quote unquote, the floor for Q&A that I will moderate. Please type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Dr. Degani, the floor is yours, my friend. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Eli and Avis, for making sure this, for me, evening, for you, afternoon, pans out. I'm very, very happy to be here. It's a pleasure. And this afternoon, we'll discuss an event that, to say that it shaped Israeli political discourse would be a massive understatement. The Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip, now 20 years passed, and these past 2 years, the disengagement has emerged as a constant referent in political debates, obviously because of the aftermath of the October 7th Hamas attack and the subsequent war. Now, this lecture delves into the establishment of a collective national memory or a collective national narrative surrounding the Gaza disengagement. I'm less interested in separating fact from persistent myths and distortions. Instead, I'm interested in explaining how these myths became seared into the Israeli collective memory. And this discussion has 3 segments. First, I'll establish the context in which Israel has the disengagement narrative has been reanimated in recent times, even a bit before October 7th. Then I'll analyze how the memory of the disengagement was forged, particularly the "we left Gaza and got terrorism in response" narrative, And finally, I'll explore the evolving settlements equals security argument that rides on the coattails of the memory of the disengagement. And I'll trace its historical development, and I'll critically analyze the current iteration of the Kevlar vest thesis, the Kevlar vest being the settlements. Now, the disengagement from the Gaza Strip was a formative historical event that fundamentally shaped Israeli and Palestinian politics and even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. After October 7th, there's no doubt that it would have become, along with the Oslo process, the starting point of a particular Israeli Zionist narrative that ends at October 7th. Like the disengagement and Oslo were the beginning of something culminating at October 7th. At October 7th. Nevertheless, the disengagement animated Israeli politics even before October 7th. It received an honorable mention during the historic events of the judicial reform. Is this shared?
Oh, not yet.
Not yet. Let's do that. Share. There we go. Okay, so this is the clever title page. There we go. So in January, okay, so the disengagement had a mentioning during the time of the judicial reform or coup, and during the massive protest movement against it and for it. In January 23, Netanyahu's sixth government, the full-on right coalition, announces the judicial laws, and it's meant to alter the balance of power between legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Opponents, leftists, centrists, but also some right-leaning people with some sort of liberal bent. They launched an unprecedented protest campaign against the coup, what they call the coup. And conversely, the settlers, they formed the core support for the government in the Knesset and on the streets. Like demonstrations for this reform were usually backed by the settler bloc. Now, amidst debates, a recurring question from reform supporters to opponents was, where were you during the disengagement? איפה היית בהתנתקות? Now, where were you during the disengagement in the immediate context that it was uttered is a question asked to deflect the argument that the Supreme Court and its independence from the Knesset and government is a guarantor of rights of minorities because it did not uphold the rights of 8,000 settlers that were uprooted in 2005. And uprooted, ne'ekru, not evacuated. That is the word that is usually used. But if you merely talk about the disengagement within the politics in Israel, whether it's in favor of the coup or any other right-wing agenda, it's effective. Invoking the disengagement, it's effective because it has become deeply ingrained in the Israeli collective memory as something negative that was carried out incorrectly and leading to, at the very least, an undesirable outcome. When someone asks, where were you during the disengagement, the questioner essentially says to the pro-settler is actually saying, we were right, and almost 70% of the public was wrong. At the time, those were the supports. At its height, 70% of Israel supported the disengagement. And this kind of the narrative that this question embodies, that this whole attitude is sort of goes something like this. We gave them a chance, they threw it away. They had the opportunity to show us their good intentions and their ability to receive sovereign territory and turn it into the Singapore of the Middle East. They, of course, the Palestinians, they threw it back in our faces in the form of rockets. And I think if Arafat and Oslo created a reluctance to enter agreements with the Palestinians, the disengagement really created despair regarding the Palestinians as a people. This is before October 7th. And the idea of a viable Palestinian state also kind of lost its credence in Israeli political imagination. A decade after the disengagement, for many, the disengagement was the ultimate proof that there's no one to talk to on the other side. Now, as someone who, on a personal level, wishes Israel would take a different course of action on the Palestinian issue, I am constantly facing this vivid memory of what the disengagement was. And you can imagine this image became even more vivid after October 7th. If it's online or if it's during high holiday dinners, if you give talks to people that are only 18, these people weren't even planned during the disengagement, but I know I'll have to argue against this memory. And how was this memory forged? Nationalistic narratives, they always omit inconvenient facts to present the nation in a positive light. That's nothing special, okay? And the memory of the disengagement is the same. Like I said, we left Gaza and got terrorism in response. That's a classic example of omitting a lot of facts. Now, one fact that this omits is the fact that it was a unilateral withdrawal, chad tzedadit. And often I've had to explain this to people. When Sharon said that this is unilateral, what he meant that we would leave a territory and that we expected nothing in return. It should have come to no surprise that the Palestinians have interpreted this as a victory for Hamas's armed struggle rather than Fatah's negotiations policies. Now, there were warnings that were sounded off in real time by Yalon and Dichter from the Shin Bet and the Chief of Staff. And also some doves were concerned, especially the dovish of all doves, Yossi Beilin, that they warned that, and Yossi Beilin really vocally protested the unilateral aspect of the disengagement, and he warned that this would be a boon to Hamas. And this was marketed as a unilateral disengagement by Dov Weissglass, chief of staff of Ariel Sharon at the time. Now, it would be very convenient for me to say that this was the real story in its entirety, right? Israel actually got what it wanted out of the disengagement, the death of the two-state solution. Like the situation that happened afterwards is exactly what Israel wanted. It was all planned. Unilateralism was the right way to go, was planned in order to disincentivize negotiations. Now, there are facts to back this up, but it's also important to point out that the whole unilateral spiel is somewhat of a collective memory of academic leftists that also omits a few things. So the Weissglass interview, which is often referenced, it is incriminating. It's one data point that says that Israel was out there to deny negotiations, to delay negotiations by doing a unilateral move. But Sharon himself, before announcing disengagement, already sprinkled that he's not the same Sharon of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. When Sharon was elected for the second time in January 2003, almost a year before he announced disengagement, he was interviewed by Ari Shavit in Haaretz, and he claimed that he remained as he was, but something changed, and he understood that Jordan will not be Palestine. A fact has been created here, and that's a big deal for Sharon. Later, Ariel Sharon, in clear opposition to the Likud's platform, accepted the roadmap for peace by the George W. Bush administration. Now, the plan itself set the goal of establishing an independent Palestinian state. Now, during the government meeting approving the plan, voices began to rise against Sharon in the government surrounding the table. David Levy said that Likud was becoming identical to the left. And Sharon answered, if you can see in the slide, you see the entire text, but it's not good to hold 3.5 million people under occupation. That's a pretty big deal for Sharon to say, and the head of the Likud. And there's more. Even though there was a facade of unilateralism that persisted until the very end, an article by Professor Eli Podeh that I recently came across shows that there was significant coordination between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It's not enough to offset the negative impact of the facade of unilateralism. Sometimes the facade itself is essential to politics, but it's not negligible. There was talks between the two sides, and the fact that after Yasser Arafat's death in November 2004, Sharon's government returned to the political process. So this isn't the Weissglass interview. This is a bit later, Yasser Arafat's death. And Sharon and Abu Mazen, they meet in February 2005. You see the picture right there, in Sharm el-Sheikh, a few months before the implementation of disengagement. And there's a summit, and Sharon declares Israel's commitment to the roadmap, which will ultimately lead to, I'm quoting, two states living side by side in peace. Where'd you find that today, for instance? Sharon then addresses the Palestinians saying, "We have a genuine intention to respect your right to a life of independence and dignity. I have already said that Israel has no desire to continue to control you and your destiny." And then he said, "We in Israel have painfully sobered up from our dreams. You too must show that you have the strength and courage to compromise, to abandon unrealistic dreams, to subdue the forces opposing peace, and to live in peace and mutual respect alongside us." These are, I think, profound words, especially coming from Sharon. And my general attitude as a historian is that I attach a lot of significance and historical weight to the declarations of leaders, if they're Arab, if it's Arafat or Mubarak, or they're Israeli. If Sharon said these things out loud, it can't be a conspiracy to lead Israel in the opposite direction. And indeed, the Israeli public, if you judge from the prominent pundits of Nechemia Stressler, Dani Rubinstein, Yoel Malkus, Ari Shavit, they saw the disengagement as an opportunity Israel gave the Palestinians, but rightly gave the Palestinians, a sort of pilot to prove that they can handle a higher degree of sovereignty. In contrast, some Israeli opinion leaders said that the threats would only get worse. You had Moshe Arens, the former Minister of Defense, Eli Moyal, the mayor of Sderot, and I have to be honest, Benjamin Netanyahu, who predicted the Strip will turn into Hamastan. Most Israelis chose to be optimists. Now, the disengagement, with its scenes of crying settlers and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of their supporters. That came and went in August. And then in January 2006, Hamas decisively wins the Palestinian elections. Now, whether Israelis had no business being so optimistic to begin with, or they had, the disappointment from the immediate aftermath of the disengagement and the election became the defining national sentiment and what would solidify the national memory of the whole event. The disengagement, according to Israelis, was carried out in good faith, and you'd have a hard time to convincing them otherwise. It's true that within half a decade after the disengagement, no more than 5 years, Netanyahu began solidifying a relationship with Hamas that would serve the settler right-wing agenda in the West Bank. Now, this pattern relied on a type of occupation over Gaza that was different from the type in the West Bank, but it's definitely occupation. And yet, if you're reading the result as if it were the Israeli intention from the beginning, it's wrong and it's unhelpful in understanding Israeli attitudes towards Gaza. So voting for Hamas, my opinion, was an unforced error by the Palestinians. There's reasons why they did that. One of them being the unilateral facade that I just talked about. And there are others. There are other reasons. But regardless, after that, the idea that occupation begets Palestinian violence became irrelevant, almost laughable among Israelis. We got out of Gaza, and the Gazans still hate us and chose Hamas. And I can explain to you, I mean, I can engage in a conversation to explain why, not because Palestinians hate us. And I can explain why if you hold an area in siege and if you bombard it and if you don't allow fishermen to go more than 5 nautical miles into the Mediterranean. And I can explain to you how demeaning the occupation over Gaza was post 2005 and that how it was a violent daily act, and rockets for Hamas were a way to secure some concessions from the occupation with the siege. But Israelis, in general, they're not there, okay? What do you want from us? The Israelis asked before October 7th. Stop firing rockets and make Gaza an amazing place. That's basically what Israelis were thinking. After October 7th, Israelis lost all patience with outside criticism of the Gaza policy. Now, with the time I have left, I want to point out how this memory affects another Israeli debate that existed before October 7th, and the West's diplomatic reaction to it have made it even more salient. Now, talking about 2 states and the idea of evacuating Israeli settlements. Now, the bitter memory of the disengagement places the Israeli settler movement, its activists, intellectuals, clerics, and political leaders in the best position to craft a narrative on what just happened in October 7th and what we should have been doing since October 8th. And in March 2024, 6 months after October 7th, Yossi Dagan, head of the Samaria Regional Council, made American calls for Israel to recognize a Palestinian state and launched a provocative political ad campaign on the billboards dominating the Ayalon Freeway, saying Samaria, Tel Aviv's Kevlar vest. The direct translation is flak jacket, shachbat, but Kevlar vest sounds better. So anyways, sorry. Anyways, The billboard featured photograph. It has a photograph of Tel Aviv with the skyline and the view from the Samaria settlement called Pduel. Now, the settler argument trailing this campaign is that as goes as so, we cleared the settlements from the Gaza Strip and uprooted 8,000 Jewish settlers living there, and we got in return October 7th. If we do the same in the West Bank, we'll get another October 7th, this time in Israel's urban centers. Now, there's an implicit assumption behind a campaign like this, which is that not all Israelis share the settlers' ideological and religious convictions about settlements. And those being the Jews have a divine right or maybe duty to settle all of Eretz Israel from the river to the sea and beyond. But non-pro-settler Israelis could be persuaded to support the settlements with a cold security arguments saying that settlements equal security and will prevent another October 7th. And the bitter memory of the disengagement creates an added openness to this claim. Now, besides the fact that 18 years of decisions and policies, most of them under right-wing pro-settler governments, even Bennett was the head of the Yesha Council, right? So all these years separating October 7th from the disengagement, still the settlers' narrative is compelling. And honestly, I think we'd be, if there wasn't disengagement in 2005, we'd be in such a different timeline. I can't imagine we'd have October 7th as we've experienced it. Not even against the settlements within the Gaza Strip. I think we'd be in a different world. So from public statements, essays, interviews, and propaganda material, I kind of condensed the settler argument for security that exists today. It's a bit complicated, so stay tuned. You know what? Back to that later. The settlers and the settlements contribute to the security of the rest of the state because they draw fire from Palestinian terrorists. This is due to the fact that settlements are located in the vicinity of the Palestinian enemy. When the settlers draw fire, the fire does not reach other parts of the country. That's simple enough, but that's only half of it. Now, the need to secure these settlements from the constant threat they live under draws in massive amounts of security forces. These security forces are what allow for the regular engagement with terrorist organizations and prevents them from growing into the size and strength that will pose an October 7th type threat. Okay, we'll get back to that if that was not entirely clear, but that is how settlements provide security according to settlers circa 2020, something like that, and since. Now, the Zionist ear readily accepts the idea that settlements, beyond their ideological value, have a security benefit. This was believed was forged during the British Mandate, probably even the Ottoman Empire, and early Israeli statehood. Settlements proved vital in the 1948 War of Independence. The question is, do settlements still provide security benefits for the Zionist project? Let's start by saying that my military career in the Golani Brigade was anything but impressive, so I have no intention or capability of addressing the veracity of the claim that settlements equal security. Instead, though, as a historian, I am qualified to trace the historical evolution of this claim, and I'll do just that from 1967 onward. The original 1967 security imperative overlapped neatly with the ideological one of why we need settlements. After 67, the belief was that the 67 borders were indefensible, and it became a truism amongst almost all Israelis. And it meant that because Israel lacked the strategic depth to stop an invasion from Jordan or Sinai, then returning to the borders of 67 would jeopardize the state's very existence, the borders of Auschwitz, as Abba Evan once said. Now, wider borders equaled more security, and settlements, signifying an intent to stay, provide those wider borders. It's not just me saying this. This was Moshe Dayan, I'd say the czar of Israeli security at the time, and the quote is here, and I'll read it also. From a security standpoint, settlements today has no special importance, but the value of settlements as I value settlements most, not me, Moshe Dayan. I value settlements the most important and most significant factor in creating political facts, uvdot mediniot. And this is based on the assumption that a place where we establish a settlement or a foothold, we will not move from it. Future defense ministers, Rabin, Weizmann, Arendts, they echoed the original security rationale. Settlements expand borders, thus enhancing security. And this works on the principle that facts on the ground shape reality, a concept long proven effective in Zionist history. So while the territory to be annexed was up for debate between Labor and Likud, I mean, different maps were in the political imaginations of both camps, but both parties shared the view that settlements are a precursor to annexation. And annexation means security. Now, it was legal challenges in 78, 79, specifically against the Bet El and Alon Moreh settlements that prompted a new security argument for Israeli settlements. The settlements, Alon Moreh and Bet El, were built on private Palestinian land. And initially, the IDF justified these land conversations for security reason, which should have been enough for the Israeli High Court. But the Palestinian plaintiffs argued that settlements that are civilian by definition couldn't be considered a security measure because they were civilian installments. So now the army couldn't make that original claim in front of the courts that settlements were a prelude to annexation because the whole legal basis for ruling the territories was that it was a temporary measure. So the IDF, and maybe this is, I should mention in a sentence that the Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It annexed East Jerusalem, but as in accordance more or less with the Fourth Geneva Convention. They haven't annexed these areas, and it was under the pretense of temporariness. So the IDF claimed that the presence of the settlers helps against infiltrators from Jordan and Egypt, possibly, and they're an auxiliary lookout. Like the settlements themselves have a security benefit. Now, if it's true or not, who convinced the Supreme Court that the settlers in Alon Moreh were in fact not motivated by security reasons? So I'll tell you, it wasn't B'Tselem, it wasn't Peace Now, it wasn't Breaking the Silence. It was members of the Alon Moreh settler cell, Garin themselves. Rabbi Menachem Felix, one of the leaders of Gush Emunim at the time, the settler corps, wrote in a deposition that he and his colleagues moved to Alon Moreh because basically God told them to. Settling in the West Bank isn't about security, it's about fulfilling a religious national calling. Felix even said that the security argument, while possibly sincere, doesn't really matter. In Hebrew, lo ma'aleh velo morid. Now, why did Gush Emunim trash the state's argument? Why couldn't they just keep their mouth shut? The reason is that they despised this revised security argument, that settlements have a security benefit in and of themselves, because for them, the land is not occupied, it's not held temporarily. It is liberated and should stay that way. And any high court ruling that relies on this premise of temporary occupation will actually strengthen it. Chagai Segal, a member of the settler aristocracy and a Jewish terrorist, also called this claim that settlements are established for security reasons, I quote, "It's a Likudnik bluff." Okay, so the court would not allow settlements to be created on private Palestinian land. But the court, Judge Landau, affirmed the security benefit of settlements in and of themselves, and that the settlements provided a measure of security in their settlement, in their inhabitants of that area. They helped the army address threats from the state's enemies. But the person most responsible for the final iteration of the security rationale is none other than Ariel Sharon, and it has to be very ironic that it's him. In his 1989 biography, published during the height of the First Intifada, Sharon began to formulate this new thesis, which he refined in 1994 in he refined in 1994 in a 1994 op-ed in Idiot Achronot, arguing against the evacuation of the Netzarim settlement in the Gaza Strip. You can't make this up. He was that this is the same Sharon that ends up evacuating Netzarim. Sharon begins with a classic argument: settlements determine borders, and 67 borders are insecure. But then he adds that the presence of settlements, especially after the Oslo Accords, allows for maintaining a military presence from which immediate intervention can be carried out. Blocking routes, apprehending terrorists, striking the heads of terror organizations, and other things that we shouldn't talk about. The settlements then and now serve as a forward base, not against enemy states which we have a border, but as a forward base against the Palestinians within our borders. But if the settlements serve as a kind of forward base, why not use forward military bases? Why is there a need to maintain a civilian settlement in the area? I'm glad you're asking. This returns to the Kevlar vest thesis. Now, according to Sharon, a civilian settlement in a place like Gaza Strip in the 90s requires, magic of AI made this slide, daily military presence. Children need to be escorted to school. A woman in labor to the hospital. Vegetables need to be taken from the greenhouses to the markets, and the doctor needs to be escorted to visitations. This creates a routine of activity, of movement. Among a normal people, am normali, there is also a motivation to protect its citizens, to defend children, as in Netzarim, when there is only military outposts and difficulties arise, such as ambushes and landmines, daily patrols are no longer conducted, and it is not ensured that traffic routes remain permanently open. Ultimately, not long after, the situation is created that there's no longer movement. So, kind of idea that by having settlers, I'll get into. I'll explain this in more detail. So I promise not to assess the validity of the security rationale, but I detect there's some potential circular reasoning. The settlement security advantage stems from the constant threat they face. We place civilians in danger only to secure them. Settlements that were initially meant to establish a border, now they bring the enemy within our borders. The danger of living in the settlement and the resulting need of the army protection, that gives control over the area. Daily threats to the settler is a feature of the settler project. It's not a bug, and it justifies the military presence. Now, again, I want to reiterate the argument. If you place settlers, your own citizens, among an enemy population, the threat posed to them, requiring security from your own military, and the military's presence prevents the amassing of force by the terrorist. That's just doesn't make any sense. Now, more than being irrational, it also glosses over a shift in the dynamic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you're coming up with new reasons for why the settlement brings security, maybe that means the nature of the threat Israel faces has changed. What we can find between the lines of the story of how settlements and security evolved after 67 is that the Palestinians in the territories gradually turned from a mostly passive population to the avant-garde of the Palestinian national movement and resistance to Zionism. From a population that was freely moved within Israel and cities were frequented by Israelis looking for hummus and dentistry, they became the biggest challenge to Zionism since 1948. I see that I have a little less than 2 minutes, so I'll just wrap things up. Now, this feature does not really work with every threat and settlement, right? You look at these are the stars are where the Gaza envelope communities were. They were very close to the enemy, right? Why were they not protected in October 7th? Why was there 32 battalions in Judea and Samaria and only 2 to 4 battalions surrounding the Gaza envelope? And before the disengagement, there were 12 battalions, because according to the Kevlar vest theory, there ought to be, because the settlements are daily threatened. Well, the drawdown has to do with the fence, the fact that you could provide normal life, not completely safe. I mean, it wasn't easy living in the Gaza envelope before October 7th, but you could provide a decent life without the need for so many boots on the ground, as one says. And whereas in the West Bank, where there's settlements dotting the entire area, there's hills, there's a lot of vegetation. There are outposts with even no fences, no security fences. Then you need a lot more, a lot more. And so, where would you take them? You take them from where you don't need them anymore. We took them out of the Gaza envelope. Now, don't take my word for it. You know who else noticed this? It was Salah el-Aroui, deputy head of Hamas's political bureau, who served as a remote director of Hamas's terror activity in the West Bank. He gave an interview, it's quite jarring, a month before the attack to a Lebanese website. He stated that Hamas was preparing a massive attack, and meanwhile, it has succeeded in tying down over 30 IDF battalions. The number was 32. It's pretty impressive. And it seems that Hamas understood very well the Kevlar vest thesis, and it exploited it. If West Bank settlements require security, that security must come from somewhere. That's where the Israelis will be weak. The Gaza envelope, we remained weak on that day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnon. Hold on, let me do this for a second. There you go. Now we can see each other. All righty, folks, this is the time. This is a Q&A session, which is the most interesting, the most dynamic of this talk, in addition to Dr. Degani's dynamic talk, obviously. So let me start with a kind of a question about perceptions, ideology, and reality. What comes first? Do we evaluate reality based or through the prism of our ideology? So everything that we thought about the 2005 disengagement plan is basically a kind of an expression or a projection of whatever we thought before that? Or is there a different mechanism? Do people come up with different ideas, different perception from the void, from nothing, so to speak?
That's a good question. The cop-out would be, oh, it's both. But I think that if we can evaluate things as historians, if we can kind of look at cases and appreciate their uniqueness, I think that the again, like I said in the talk, Hamas's victory in 2006 was so decisive, and it led to a fastly deteriorating state. And it's not as if Israel has not made mistakes from that point on, but at least for I think Israelis, even during the height of the Second Intifada, were open to two states. The violence that the Palestinians inflicted on Israel was horrible, but it also kind of made a lot of Israelis think, why do we even need this crap anymore? The outlook, the ideological outlook that Palestinians are basically haters and they'll always hate us, I think was to a large extent shaped by, it could have been the contrast between the hopes of the disengagement, the internal rift that it caused, the sense that we are really hurting ourselves in order to create this move, and then the disappointing result, I think, was detrimental or was determined a lot of the ideological results of what it meant to be Israeli ever since, I think.
All righty. Well, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Please add yours as much as possible. We want to challenge Dr. Degani and make this more dynamic than before. This is kind of a conceptual historical or kind of history as a vocation, so to speak. What is the basis for the belief that official statements of the statesmen represent aptly their real intentions? You mentioned Sharon in this regard. Isn't it more that politicians, because they are politicians at the end of the day, or alongside being leaders, are more compelled to say something, but then work on avoiding implementing it, for example? The ultimate argument in this regard is Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah.
So how do we, in other words, how do we know that Sharon was genuine and true and faithful to the words that he said, rather than having some ulterior motive, so to speak, a manipulative agenda?
The cliche would be that as a historian, I'm not a psychologist. I can't enter the mind of the
You're
historical
still,
subject.
once again, you're copping out, once again.
Yes, so, but I am pointing out the cop-out answer, and then it's a caveat, basically. It's a method of caveating my own words. I'll say that there was also I just didn't have time to mention it, but in the podcast where I talk about this, I devote a lot of lines to laying out the thesis that the deeper the interrogations, the deeper the uprooting. This is in Hebrew it rhymes. The idea that he did this whole thing as a distraction of his legal woes. And there's good reason. I mean, it could be a part of it also. That could have been also a factor. He wanted some sort of distraction. The reason I would doubt, and he was also he died a very well. I mean, he expired. I would say cognitively in a very wealthy, well-to-do man. I would not be surprised if he was somewhat corrupt, but he did devote a lot of his life to the country. He was in every important crossroad. He devoted his life to fighting Arafat. And so it seems to me that he would not have taken this 108-degree turn if he didn't have some sort of internal rationalization for it. And having said that, once Sharon says it out loud and explains and even positions it in the context of the roadmap, right? Then I think that that is the historical, that is concrete historical truth, and all the rest is speculative.
I got you. All righty. One other question that, in a way, kind of echoes perhaps some of the comments that I just mentioned. Now, Sharon's evolution is fascinating, right? From a hawk to a dove. And I think that one of the participants actually wrote an article about that, how this has happened. Do you think this is a product of the practical realism that he was advocating for now, or at the time, as opposed to before, that comes from a responsibility of his role? In other words, מה שרואים מכאן, לא רואים משם. What you see from here, you don't see from there. In terms of where you sit is where you stand. If not, what drove this? And was it sincere? Again, going back to the issue. So in other words, do leaders learn? Do they change their minds? Do they evolve?
I think a lot of the circling back to your first question, whether it's ideological convictions that are determinant rather than reactions to history, then I think there is a basic ideological conviction that would create a shift in someone's outlook. And I think that quote that Jordan will not be Palestine. I think that, once you realize that there's another national entity within Western Palestine, Western Eretz Israel, then it's mathematical. The issue becomes, so if there's another nation, presumably it will not want to live under the rule of our rule and will constantly resist, as it has. And so there's one way of going at it is to create a binational state, and the other one way is to annihilate them or hope they don't annihilate us. The other way is to share sovereignty, and there's only two ways to share, either in two states or one state that's binational. And so I think again, once you internalize this fact, it's very hard to maintain the notion that the entirety of Western Eretz Israel can remain under Israeli control as a Jewish democratic state.
Kind of the visions of greater Israel.
Yeah. So there is a hard reality here that that any person that's not motivated by the notion of a messianic intervention would have to come to terms with. So This is
Oh,
and someone, yeah.
yeah. I wrote about historical analogies, and so we're trying to, among other things, kind of connect the 2005 and the 2025. One question that perhaps kind of resonates with that logic: what was the relationship between Fatah and Hamas during that period? And perhaps what's the relationship now, if you can make any comments about that? I know you're a historian, but nevertheless, do you see any resemblance there?
It's a good question. It's key to understanding this period. I think there's a way of looking at Hamas that reconceptualizing Hamas after October 7th, something I've devoted a lot of thinking because I was dead wrong. I never thought October 7th could happen. I didn't think that Hamas would jeopardize its own existence or rule over Gaza with such a atrocious attack. There's reason to believe maybe they didn't think they'd be so successful, but it was still the planning, the personnel. They had to know that they were going for all or nothing, and I never thought this was in the cards with Hamas. So I got to thinking a lot about what is Hamas, basically. And if you go to all the scholarly works by very important people, smart, not necessarily left wing, not necessarily sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, not necessarily non-Zionists. I think there's a way of understanding Hamas as being the Palestinian right wing. Israel will always have an Israeli right wing, and the Palestinians have a right wing. Now, that doesn't mean the right wing doesn't, that the existence of a right wing doesn't mean that that country cannot pursue left-wing agenda. The idea is that within national politics, you can contain major disagreements, including the wholeness of the land that you to control. So I think this is the game Hamas wanted to play. Hamas wanted to be the part of the national Palestinian movement that never recognizes Israel. As much as I'm sure that there will never be that Smotrich and probably his sons and his grandkids will never recognize the Palestinian people that have rights in Eretz Israel. So the circumstances that were created where there was a parliament that had elections, but there wasn't a state with an army, that there wasn't sovereignty. It created this kind of middling situation where the Palestinian Fatah, but also Israel, but also the United States could understand the existence of an armed organization as part of Palestinian politics. And that creates almost an impossible situation. Because if you have the more pragmatic wing of the Hamas, the fact that they have an army at their disposal, that is too much of a temptation to set the agenda via guns. So this is a situation that Israel is, the idea that you could merge the Hamas into the Palestinian Authority wasn't so popular among Israelis, but I think today we understand that in terms of lessons that I've learned from October 7th and the last 20 years, is that at the end of the day, we need to negotiate with the Palestinians. We don't necessarily need to negotiate with Hamas. We need to negotiate with a unified Palestinian leadership that also has a monopoly over the means of violence. So I don't know because it's not even the relationship between do they like each other or they don't like each other. They recognize each other as wings of the same national movement. The problem is that the historical circumstances have led to the fact that one wing is armed to the teeth and is not bound by international norms, and one is bound by international norms and is the one that's recognized. So this kind of anomaly is, I think, what shapes the relationship. It's not just seculars against religious people or dove versus hawks. There the Trump plan, which understands any of its points. But the Trump plan does address the idea of disarmament is important. Yeah.
All right, we have a couple of questions. One from David Siegel, who's a very good friend of ours here. He's a sociologist and he studied the Israeli military. And we have another question from a professor at the University of Delhi, and I'll try to kind of tailor the two together, kind of stitch the two together. And they relate to the legacies, the military legacies of the disengagement plan or the disengagement enterprise as a whole. David Siegel asks, when were the all-women field observer units overlooking activities in the Gaza Strip established? Was this part of the disengagement? Were they regularly disregarded as they were in the days leading up to October 8th? And from University of Delhi, how did the 2005 disengagement plan influence Israel's overall security doctrine and its approach to unilateral withdrawals? In other words, what was the actual lesson learned from the Israeli perspective, from the Israeli defense establishment's perspective?
Thank you for the two questions. I have to profess ignorance about
because you mentioned, for example, the fact that they diverted military forces to the West Bank. Was this kind of because they assumed that nothing is happening? Because
no, it's important to say that the diversion is took the span of 18 years, right? The map of threats changed, and there was a drawdown surrounding the Gaza division, and there was a buildup in the West Bank. There are some theories bordering on the conspiratorial, but others, basically, some units were moved on the eve of October 7th to the West Bank because the threats were different and required more people on the ground. The outposts, these are I can't tell you the dates. These units are ideally suited for border areas where you point the technological instruments towards the other side, and you know that whatever happens there is suspect. At the time where there was some sort of imbrication between settlements and the Palestinian threat, then I'm not saying that there weren't these kinds of units within Gaza in 2005, but the bulk of security had to do with soldiers patrolling and showing their presence in everywhere they can be. Whereas when you have a border there's an obstacle in and of itself, and these units are far more efficient. And so I guess this is what we have here. Why were they ignored? I'm not sure that they were completely ignored. There could be other stories. I don't want to speak I'm out of my depth here. This is too recent for this historian. But in general, the fact that they were not well secured, and heads should roll. What can I say? It was a true shame, and these soldiers were an important part of the first line. And,
alrighty, and sorry, please go ahead. My apologies.
And the question coming at us all the way from Delhi.
Yeah,
I can't, for some reason I can't see.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I removed it because I thought you.
I see. There I have it.
No.
Influence Israel's overall security doctrine and approach. I can get it in the podcast in Hebrew. I get into this, and this isn't, but I'll just say Israel became addicted to the concept of deterrence after 2005. The Hamas, the people on the other side, not only in Gaza, also like the terrorist organizations in the West Bank, and of course Hezbollah, they will always attack us. There is nothing that needs to be done on the kind of diplomatic level. There is no need to find some sort of permanent agreement with either Hamas, those were on the table, or Hezbollah, or Syria influencing Hezbollah. We just have to wait it out and occasionally hit them on the head. If they attack us, we hit them on the head hard, so next time they know that they'll postpone the attack. This is a conditioning that they ended up taming us, because if this is what you do, you just wait for some sort of escalation and then you mow the lawn, to be crass. This is how this is the security speech in Israel. If you do that, then you assume that if no one's attacking you at a time, then there is deterrence. It has worked. And if you attack just out of the blue, you can't establish deterrence. If you just start bombing Hamas, then they'll attack at any time. So basically, they taught us not to attack them if they're not doing anything, if they're planning, if they're amassing force. And that's what happened. A complete reliance on the notion of deterrence. The Molad, the kind of liberal think tank I belong to, two fellows have written a very detailed report on deterrence and how we got here, and well cited, and it shows it shows that this is a concept of a conceptia that goes beyond the prime minister or the chief of staff. This was really woven into the security establishment that also encompasses scholars and military pundits, and it's really interesting to see and tragic.
All righty, so we're almost out of time, and one caveat from the audience actually is the fact that you're a historian, but we have a couple of questions that relate to the future.
Right.
One is, do you have an idea how?
No one is better than me than to
absolutely
answer
right?
that.
Well, there's a classical book about why we never learn from history.
Right.
Do you have any idea how future potential or imagined disengagement from the West Bank would look like in order to be more successful? And this is in part given the current realities on the ground when, for example, US President Trump says there will be no annexation, or else there's not going to be any relationship between Israel and the United States. So tying it to another question, is that a feasible scenario, a disengagement larger scale in the West Bank? And secondly, how would it look like in order to try to mitigate some of the negative ramifications of the 2005 disengagement as you describe those?
I think that if we want to learn from history, then we cannot have unilateralism. Won't work. If the soldiers just retreat, then there's no reason that Hamas will not take over the West Bank immediately. And also, we have to take into account that those 8,000 settlers that were uprooted or evacuated, I don't think this was the kind of the Algerian, the fall of the Fourth Republic or Third Republic with Algeria, but it was not that far away, I think. But if we have to evacuate, let's say 200, 300,000 Palestinians, settlers,
Israeli,
and I think a different approach is needed. I think that we need to come to terms with the fact that if there are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, and I appreciate that fact. I think it's a boon to Israel. I think it's a good thing in Israeli society. I think this is I would say an inoculation against anti-democracy. Doesn't seem to be working, but the idea that we have a minority, a national minority, I think it's fine. And I also think that the future Palestinian state can also absorb those that are willing to stay in a Palestinian state and obey its laws, maybe have some sort of collective status as Israelis whose state is, a few kilometers away, but and they won't have the benefits that come with living in a settlement. And I think like the Pied Noir in Algeria, a lot of them will choose to come back out of their own volition.
All righty. So one last question, if you like. Oh, we talked about kind of trying not to overstate the impact, the dramatic impact of the 2005 disengagement on Israeli society. What would you identify as the most profound, the most significant change in Israeli society, politics, that perhaps is lingering, was perhaps exacerbated by the attack of 2023, my apologies, October 7th. Is this something reversible, or is it?
Yes, I think it is reversible. If you look at history, then the one constant is change, and sometimes abrupt change. So I am a firm believer of the fact that so if there's a certain secular trend, that doesn't mean that trend lasts forever, and it could abruptly change. And October 7th was that kind of event, and we might have other events. The disengagement, the Sharon's decision was that kind of event. In hindsight, you can see the telltale signs, but these are only seen in hindsight. We could be living through the change right now. We see somewhat of a different approach by Europe. And I frankly never thought that a Republican administration post Obama would utter the words Palestinian state, would allow for daylight between the Israeli government and the U.S. Not a lot of good whether it's a good or bad thing, it's something I think only Trump could have done, and he's a wild card. He's not beholden to any norms. One of them being that Israel is the most important strategic partner of the U.S. So that opens up possibilities then.
Right.
So
and he also met Mahmoud Abbas or Abu Mazen in Sharm el-Sheikh just recently, which is something that came after boycotting the Palestinian Authority during Trump 1.0 presidency.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can, if I can just say an anecdote, in 2015, one of the first primary debates with all the other Republicans, all of them were asked the question about Israel, and each one of them, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, whoever, they were all more Zionist than Zionist, right? They were completely pro-Israel and thought that the Palestinians were subhuman, kind of shorthand. But Trump came up and he said, "I'm not going to say I'm pro-Israel," and I think it was just using healthy logic of saying that if I'm supposed to be the mediator of these two sides, then if I announce right away that I'm pro one of them, that would not make me a very good mediator. I don't think he was briefed. I don't think he can place Israel, Palestine on the map. And afterwards, Jared or Friedman kind of grabbed him and said, "No, you can't do this." Won the Republican primary, and he became the most pro-Israel president in history, as a lot of Israelis. But intuitively, he doesn't have these convictions, these messianic convictions about Israel. So I think the options are maybe a bit more open.
All righty, we're out of time. I want to thank you, Dr. Degani, for a wonderful conversation, for a wonderful talk. I'd like to thank the audience for attending this special webinar. Just to remind you, the next event online, Dr. Vered Weiss will talk about Israeli culture and art in the shadow of conflict, November 18th, 6 p.m. Eastern Time. More information.
Thanks so much.
Register www.israelstudies.umd.edu. Thank you so much, Arnon.
Yeah, and I see that there's questions I've left unanswered, and I'm not technologically impaired. I'd love to answer emails or WhatsApps or DMs on Twitter.
You can Google him. You can find him online on X. He's very active there, so you'll find him. No doubt about that. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.